West and the Islamic world are, in my opinion, fundamentally incompatible. In the West, our religious teachings, coupled with Enlightenment values, have created over the generations the most technologically advanced and tolerant society on earth. While I am not a believer in God or a defender of the Church, it is undeniable that the information contained in the Bible has helped shape the West and who we are as a civilization. As we began to question our place in the cosmos and understand more of the natural world, the Holy Book was scrutinized, and the morality contained in its pages was called into question by the great minds of the 18th century. Instead of taking the word as literal, which was the normal practice, each verse was interpreted philosophically, and the moral content contained within those verses was unlocked. Although the Church resisted progress in the name of blasphemy with the use of deadly force, our values, culture, laws and behaviours, which are centred around human freedom, have been heavily influenced by the moral findings contained in the Bible. The resulting system created is objectively better and more conducive to human freedom than any other system developed in history. A system which promotes the power of the individual and holds critical thinking, free inquiry and tolerance as paramount. In my opinion, those who oppose free inquiry or freedom of speech are no better than those who ordered the use of the sword for blasphemy. I count myself incredibly lucky to have been born and raised in a country built on a foundation of Christianity and Enlightenment values, which in my opinion serves to enhance our sense of humanity. Islam has never been subject to any kind of reformation. It is a religion which demands strict obedience or submission. Its prophet, the Prophet Muhammad, and its holy book, the Quran, are so sacred to its adherents that to criticize them would likely result in a punishment of physical harm, including death. Most famously, in 1989 with the release of Salman Rushdie's book, The Satanic Verses, the theocratic leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khomeini, publicly called for the death of the author and offered a reward. His book, which was partly inspired by the life of Muhammad, was viewed as deeply offensive to the devout and resulted in riots and violent demonstrations across the world. In 2005, a Danish newspaper published several cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad. News of the blasphemous drawings reached Muslim-majority countries overnight, resulting in attacks on Danish and European diplomatic missions, churches and Christians. The violence around the world was reported to have claimed the lives of over 250 people. In Paris, France, in 2015, in the offices of the satirical newspaper Charlie Hebdo, two Islamist gunmen armed with M70 rifles, capable of firing over 600 rounds a minute, discharged their weapons. For the crime of blasphemy, they killed 12 innocent people and injured 11 others. Such actions of pure evil in defense of the faith were celebrated across the Islamic world. Many Muslims and Western sympathizers on the left responded to the killings in Paris as an act of terrorism, while at the same time expressing that the innocent cartoonists knew what they were doing was offensive. I submit that if you are willing to even remotely suggest that a cartoon could be so offensive that it would, or even could, warrant any kind of violent retribution, you should be completely ashamed of yourself. In my opinion, the Islamic view of freedom of speech and expression is incompatible with Western values, making a reformation highly improbable. I would suggest that the greatest victims of Islam are the Muslims themselves. They are trapped in a system which punishes misbehaviour very severely. The crime of apostasy or leaving the faith is an offence punishable by death. Homosexuality is an offence punishable by death. To be born a woman in such a society is to be born as an object with less worth than that of a man. Your life will likely begin with a local religious fanatic cutting off your clitoris and labia with a sharp stone and sewing your vagina almost shut, only leaving a small opening for menstruation. Recently in Ireland, a couple from Africa carried out the act of female genital mutilation on their own daughter. They brought the child to the hospital when they could not control the bleeding and lied to the medical staff about her injuries, saying she had fallen on a toy. Their lies would continue in court, but they were eventually found guilty. This is a completely heartbreaking start to the life of any child, but the road is long and narrow for a child of Islam. Women are forced to live in cloth bags and may be subjected to public floggings should they unveil themselves, or be stoned to death should they express themselves in ways that are not viewed as moderate. The Quran sets out the rules of the game, and those willing to enforce those rules exercise immense control and power. Such power has been long sought after by religious militias like the Taliban, Al Qaeda, and Islamic State. Their desire to create a civilization based on their own interpretation of Islam has brought nothing but war, death, and misery. Those wars have reached the shores of Europe with devastating effect. In the last 5 years, the European Parliament, in an act of suicidal kindness, has implemented policies which have seen the mass movement of Muslims into Europe. Cities and systems have been overwhelmed with millions of people from the Islamic world seeking refuge. Their numbers are so great that they have been able to control large areas of towns. The violence exhibited in many of these locations has been so severe that they have been classified as no-go zones. Not even the police dare to enforce the law in these places. It has since been proven that the majority of those who travelled to Europe did so for economic reasons and not to escape war or persecution, meaning that they abandoned their home, their land, their people and their flag. But what they did not abandon is their faith, their cultural practices and their traditions, which in many ways still serves to cause individual Muslims much hardship and is periodically forced upon Europeans in the form of violent retribution for being sinful in the eyes of the Prophet. Beheadings, bombings, stabbings and rapes have become somewhat less shocking to hear in the news over the years, so often are such crimes committed. Depending on the crime, I find myself speculating on who the perpetrator could be. I think we all do nowadays. At this stage I ask you, can the values we hold dear in Ireland and in the West coexist with the values of Islam? Should our tolerance extend to the practice of a system which runs counter to our own? Should churches, which are emptier than ever, be replaced with mosques full of the devout? Should we change how we live our lives to accommodate those of the faith? Looking at places like London, Paris, Brussels and Stockholm, these questions will need answers in the coming years, and I hope when the time comes that those answers do not come from the minds of the liberal left, but from the minds of the patriots.